colleague chair of Budget Sub 4, Senator Mark DeSaulnier, and pleased to also have his committee member here, Senator Gloria Negrete-McLeod. We're here today to welcome and to thank the California Sex Offenders Management Board for their ongoing good work, and also to have them present to us their January 2010 recommendations and report. Budget Sub 4 and the Committee on Public Safety will continue to partner in our efforts to better coordinate budget and policy decision-making in this era of ever-dwindling resources. And I'm personally looking forward to this hearing because we know the very nature of this particular crime. As the report quotes, legacy of sexual assault in the lives of victims is often profound and long-lasting. Also, the highly emotionally charged nature of these crimes makes decision-making and policy-making all that much more difficult. And we need to make sure that our limited resources are invested in those efforts that we know, evidence-based, will prevent future reoffenses and keep our communities safer. And some of the suggestions and recommendations from this report and from earlier reports by the board would suggest that the legislature has yet to really listen to the information they're bringing forward and to the facts of these evidence-based programs. So with that, I will ask my co-chair of today's hearing, Senator DeSaulnier, to say a few words.
I thought you were going to miss me again there, Senator. We had a moment sometime earlier in San Francisco where Mark missed me, so I, being a good colleague, I bring it up frequently. Anyways, I just want to say how happy I am to be here, in the sense that I think there is a commitment to really make, both from the board in particular, but from my colleague and from colleagues, that maybe we can change the discussion. And Mark alluded to this, that for crimes that are so emotive to so many of us, and justly so, we as a culture and individually, but if we can use best practices and evidence-based programs to actually assure that the public will be safer, this is a key moment, I think, in California. And on the second panel, on the Dugard case, having that happened in not terribly far from where I live in my district, knowing how emotional that was and difficult for that community and the people affected, the family and all the people, including the officers of the department, that there's a specific case of can we perhaps learn that how do we can possibly avoid this from happening again, knowing that human nature being it is, as the resources are, as Mark alluded to, stretched, that we can at least do everything humanly possible to make sure that cases like this don't happen again in the future. So I'm looking for a very serious discussion, a reasoned discussion, and that will result in actual actions by the legislature that will make the public safer. So I look forward to the testimony.
Okay.
Let the record show that Senator Negrete-McLeod is having breakfast.
We want to ask the board members to please join us for the first section of our hearing. The board was created by a legislative act of 2006, legislation authored by then Assemblywoman Judy Chu, and it was our Committee on Public Safety's committee bill of last year which removed the sunset so that the board can continue to do its very important work. So we welcome the board now, Suzanne Brown McBride, who's the Executive Director of California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, Janet Neely, who's Deputy Attorney General, Detective Diane Webb from the Los Angeles Police Department, Jerry Powers, Chief Probation Officer from Stanislaus County, and our good friend Dr. Tom Tobin, California Coalition on Sexual Offending. Welcome, board members.
Thank you so much, Senator, for your kind introduction. I'm Suzanne Brown McBride, and as introduced, I'm the Executive Director of the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault. We're the Association of California Sexual Assault Crisis Centers, and last year our victim advocates worked with about 25,000 victims of sexual assault. And so in addition to my honor as serving as the board chair for the California Sex Offender Management Board, one of the things that I bring to this hearing is the perspective of a victim advocate, somebody who has worked for almost 20 years now with victims of sexual sexual assault from the moment after crisis to years after that experience to try to make sure that the system can do what we promise, that we're going to make communities safe, that we're going to effectively intervene with those who prey on our families and our children, and that we're also going to ultimately figure out what we can do to prevent these crimes overall. And so I wanted to give a couple introductory comments about the board itself, as well as to highlight some of the ways that we approach talking about the management of adult sex offenders. As Senator Leno, as you mentioned earlier, this is one of the most polarizing and difficult issues, I think, in criminal justice. And for those of us and all of the folks who are sitting at this table who have on-the-ground, real-life experience working with victims of sexual assault and sex offenders, we have struggled and looked and tried to figure out what we can do to be of assistance to the policymakers who I think are facing incredibly difficult and challenging dilemmas. Sexual assault is a complex issue. What I learned as a victim advocate is that no one victim's experience is alike, that every person has a potential to be victimized. Some communities are racked and ravaged by sexual violence, and other communities struggle day to day with huge and high-profile crimes that draw the public's attention. And because of that, we've also learned that no one sex offender is alike, that what we learn from any one crime may be able to highlight certain gaps in the system, it may be able to highlight certain problems that we face, but that no one offender should serve as a guideline for everything that we do in the state. And so I think that you'll hear us struggle and talk about that as we talk about the overarching framework that the management board uses in order to talk about the management of adult sex offenders, as well as the more specific issues that cases like the Garrido case raise in terms of our work. I think the other thing that's important to recognize is that when the practitioners of the Sex Offender Management Board got together, the 17 of us who sit around the table, the volunteers who come together once a month for the last 3 years to assess California's system for the management of adult sex offenders, we come from a whole variety of backgrounds. I've already told you that I'm a victim advocate. I'm happily also another victim advocate sits on our board. But we are also law enforcement. We are probation, parole, treatment providers. We are folks who have essentially worked all around the state in urban and rural jurisdictions to try to come together on the thing that we identified as the key value of what we do here in California, which is to promote community safety and to decrease victimization. And in order to come to consensus on some of the issues that you see sort of typified in the final report that's sitting in front of you today, is that we had to believe a couple things. One, obviously, is our belief in community safety. But secondly, we also had to come together and to believe that what we needed to see was evidence. That part of the reason why sex offender management is such a difficult thing to do, part of the reason why it's hard to sort of promote certain kinds of policy is because there is rightly an enormous amount of emotion connected to it. We are rightly horrified by sex crimes. We are rightly outraged by what happens to those who experience them. But sometimes that outrage can translate into action before evidence. And what the management board did when we got together was looked at each other very earnestly and said, we have to try to find where there is evidence to demonstrate what is appropriate and right to do. We're going to let that guide us. Because for what we believe is that people in California deserve to be safe, and they deserve to believe that we approach policies and policy issues in a manner that can demonstrate what we're doing will actually work. And so what you see in the report sitting in front of you, that this is the cover to, is the summation of about 3 years' worth of work. What the governor and the legislature charged us to do when we began in 2006 was to first of all assess the system. What is California doing and not doing? What are the things we're achieving? Where are the gaps in the system? And in the subsequent, in the previous reports and the initial publications that we put out, we put those assessments out there. What we finally tried to do in this summary document of the last 3 years was to come to what the crucial issues were around the management of sex offenders, and to also deal with what we think have become some of the key and sort of emerging issues that also I think policymakers and the public are struggling with. What you'll hear us speaking about today are a few things. One is that we're going to be talking about the framework and the approach that we use to talk about management issues. The thing that all of us know at management board level is that there is no one solution to managing adult offenders. No one thing will guarantee that a sex crime won't happen, or that an offender will be held appropriately accountable, or that they won't necessarily commit their crime again. And because of that, we've had to be rightly leery of sort of those one-step solutions. If we just do this, or if we just do that, or if we just do that sort of one type of moment. And so what we looked for was a framework to inform our work that would be not only multidimensional, but multidisciplinary. That when you see gaps in the system, when you see crisis happen at the local level, oftentimes it's because only one agency or one person or one technique has been left with the burden of doing everything. And what we have tried to do is to propose and to embrace a different kind of approach that was actually originally proposed in the state of Colorado. And for those of you who have this sitting in front of you, we've drawn that up and recapitulated it for some work that a researcher named Kim English came up with called the containment approach. And containment does a couple things. First of all, it does what it says. It takes a sex offender and contains them with the systems around that individual that can help them not recommit their crimes. We talk about that as being a successful sex offender, and what we mean by that is not that offenders should be successful in reoffending, but that they should be successful in not reoffending. That we have to figure out the structures, the mechanisms, and the interventions that will keep community members safe, that will allow a sex offender to come out of institutions, because they are coming out. They will come out. And to be in communities in a way that will promote the safety and success of all involved. And we have found that the containment model, in our estimation, is the best single way to do that. What it does is it represents not only having sort of the offender as one of the primary concerns of that model, but it builds a sort of network around that offender using several tools that have been deemed through evidence to be effective. Supervision, which we'll be talking about a little bit later, treatment, using the polygraph, and victim advocacy. And by creating this network around offenders, it's a way of trying to maintain, to make sure that they can maintain their pro-social and effective place in the community, as well as, first and foremost, being able to promote public safety. And so the containment approach is one that we've used to frame our work. It's going to also frame our comments as we go down the table today. I think the other thing that is really important, and the third thing that our group agreed to when we became the management board, was that we also believed in a victim-centered approach. That too often, I think the public and the world sees the management of adult sex offenders as somehow opposed or a binary opposite to being concerned about victims and safety. And as a victim advocate, I can tell you that that's not true. That one of the ways you promote community safety is to make sure that those who pose a potential risk are managed in the most effective way possible. One of the ways that you hold victims precious and close is by making sure that we do absolutely everything we can to look at our community members with integrity and honesty and say that we take your safety seriously. And what we've tried to do as a management board is to look over some of the very practical elements of what we do to manage sex offenders, from the nuts and bolts of things like GPS supervision to what we consider to be one of the most dangerous things in California, which is the lack of appropriate housing. We have seen in California over the last several years an aggressive and ever-increasing number of bills and pieces of law dedicated to intervening on behalf of victims of sexual assault and on the behalf of, or on sex offender issues. And I think that the impetus for doing that is honorable. People care deeply about it. I have never been struck by any person who's talked to me about these issues, whether I agree with their approach or not, that has not been deeply, deeply concerned about the impact of sexual violence on California's communities. But what we've tried to do is to identify which approaches are actually more effective, which ones represent the best use of what we know to be scarce dollars on a very, very serious crime. And so from the nuts and bolts, like certain types of supervision intervention, we've also tried to stay up at the more global issue of how do we create an entire system that manages sex offenders. Because as much as it's great to talk about certain kinds of intervention, whether it be a residence restriction or a GPS intervention or something like that, we have to remember that part of why systems fail is things like communication. Things like when we don't talk to one another, when we don't share information effectively. And so the board has tried to attend to both of those issues, to be able to give people a sense of what it looks like to not just build a mechanism, but to build a system of intervention, and one that recognizes that we are a more mobile, more connected, more communicative public than ever before. That it's not all right to say, well, this is what we're going to do on this street, this is what we're going to do on this block, or this is what we're going to do in this city, but to recognize that people move from city to city, from county to county, from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and that our systems have to be able to handle that and understand that and share the kind of knowledge so that people on the ground can make good decisions. And part of, I think, our work here in Sacramento is to do that, to figure out how to build that overarching system. And I think that's when we can look at victims and look at people in the community and say, this is what we've done to try to build a system. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Janet Neely to talk a little bit about one of the first elements, which is our registration process.
Thanks. Thanks, Suzanne. I'm Deputy Attorney General Janet Neely. I represent and have represented the Sex Offender Registry in California for about 20 years now, and I represent the Attorney General not only on this board, the Sex Offender Management Board, but also on the state's risk assessment committee, which is called the Sorazzo Committee. So what I'd like to do here is just give you a brief overview of how we got where we are today in California, the good strides that we've made in improving sex offender management practices in California, but then to talk about where we think we need to go and the board thinks we need to go to have much better effective sex offender management for the state. California was the very first state in the nation to enact sex offender registration laws. We did it in 1947. Most states enacted their laws in the 90s. And the reason we did it then was due to a huge case in the LA area that generated a blitz of media attention, which was called the Black Dahlia case. Since 1947, California kind of just moved along, registering offenders as they came in after they were convicted of registrable sex offenses, and didn't do a whole lot until the mid-90s when things really took off. In the mid-90s, there was federal legislation mandating the states do certain things. California made its own attempt to distinguish among types of sex offenders, because by 1994, when we had our first bill trying to distinguish among riskier and less risky offenders, we had a lot of sex offenders. We probably had close to 50,000 registrants at that point, since we've been doing registration for so long, and yet we had no way to distinguish high from low-risk sex offenders. So there was a statute called the Sexual Habitual Offender Bill that went through, and DOJ helped profile those offenders that were identified by the statute as higher risk. Unfortunately, that system was not evidence-based. It wasn't based on the research that even then was being done by social scientists, and so it was more an educated guess, which turned out not to be so valid as to who was a more serious a risk of reoffending and who wasn't. For the past 25 years, there have been multiple scientific studies by social scientists looking at released sex offenders to discover what factors about those offenders' histories best correlate with risk of reoffense. And so we have this solid body of research at this point to draw on to see what statistically makes somebody at higher risk of reoffending, just like actuarial tables do for your insurance premiums. They set your insurance premiums based on your driving history. They make a statistical prediction as to your chance of having another accident, and they have a statistical prediction that your rate is based on. Basically, the social science behind sex offender risk assessment is very similar. We enacted our Megan's Law, our public notification about sex offenders law, in 1996, which was great. Let law enforcement, which Detective Webb is going to talk more about on-the-ground compliance and enforcement of registration laws in a minute. Let them notify the public when they thought somebody was posing a current risk. We put people on the internet. It was good, and it wasn't as precise as it could be, because right now, if you look on the internet, to see, say, who's in your neighborhood, you'll see that someone who, or maybe you won't be able to see, someone who committed multiple rape murders and who's been out of prison for just a few months after a 20-year term, who may be quite high risk to reoffend, is classed in the same category, meaning full address is displayed on the website, as somebody who may have molested a family member under 14 35 years ago and has no subsequent criminal history. Or they may be classed in the same category as an 18-year-old who had sex at a party with a 13-year-old girl and has to register for life, again with full address displayed on the website, even though this person may be extremely low risk for ever reoffending as a sex offender. So we have an imperfect system. We have public notification, which can be used effectively, but which doesn't distinguish between higher and lower risk offenders. In order to try and deal with this issue, in 2006, we enacted a risk assessment system which is scientifically based on this body of research. And the state Sorazzo Committee, the Sex Offender Risk Assessment Committee, works in both choosing risk assessment instruments to assess adults and juveniles in the state, and it trains probation officers, parole officers, and a few Department of Mental Health personnel in how to score these instruments so that we know who on our caseloads is high risk, who's moderate, and who's very low risk statistically for reoffending. Probation is doing this now pre-sentencing with every sex offender case on somebody who's going to have to register as a sex offender. It's a huge workload for probation, as I'm sure probation will be happy to tell you. And parole is doing it prior to release. Parole has been doing it for several years, actually, pursuant to one of the governor's executive orders about 3.5, almost 4 years ago now. So we are starting to get a body of scores. We have about 30,000 of our registered sex offenders that actually have a risk assessment score in the database that DOJ is keeping on risk assessment scores. The problem is today now in California, we have 90,000 registered sex offenders, 90,000, because we've been doing this for so long, and we have lifetime registration. 68,000 of those are in the community. The rest are in prison currently. There's practical problems with dealing with those kind of numbers. Detective Webb will discuss. And the board has proposed in this report that Suzanne was showing you of our board a solution to the fact that we have now so many registrants, very low-risk ones from maybe 35, 40 years ago, very high-risk ones just out of prison with multiple crimes, and no clear way to distinguish between them in a lot of cases. Because of the lifetime registration requirement, the rolls are swollen. We're one of only 4 states in the nation that requires lifetime registration for all sex offenders without regard to what offense they committed or what risk level they are now. Most states tier their offenders, Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, and those tiers are based on either the offense they committed, their risk level, or their potential for violence. Those are the main criteria for distinguishing. The board has proposed adopting a system that's done in a number of other states that would be a combination of these factors to determine low, moderate, and high-risk offenders, and the length of the registration period would be tied to that tier level. If they were a very low-risk offender and not a child molester, they would have a 10-year registration period if they stayed in compliance with our laws. If they were a child molester or a more serious offender with a higher risk score, they would have to register 20 years. And if they were a more serious offender with a high risk score and more serious offenses, or they were a sexually violent predator, they would have lifetime registration. About 30% of our California sex offenders that we have assessed so far fall in the moderate to high risk range. So the Static 99, which is our adult risk assessment instrument, a score of 0 to 1 is low risk, 2 to 3 is moderate, and 3 and 4 and above is moderate, and then 6 above is high. And we would only have about 30% if we were concentrating our resources on the moderate to high risk on our rolls after 20 years. The issues that remain to be addressed really revolve partly about amending the registration system to be more tiered and tied to risk, and about funding. And I know, as Suzanne said over and over, scarce resources, difficult issue. The Serrazzo Committee, which does the risk assessment work, has struggled, has not had consistent funding, yet we have by mandate to train parole and probation officers every year. Every 2 years, the trainers have to be retrained. We struggle to get money for that. We need to study California sex offenders and make sure that their risk predictions correlate with the other ones that have been done around the nation and the world to make sure that California's population, which as you know is very diverse, is corresponding risk-wise with the national and international studies that have been done, and that costs money. And we need money for quality assurance to make sure that our scorers are consistently and accurately scoring these instruments that the courts rely on in sentencing, and that probation and parole is relying on to do compliance when they're out in the field. So we just hope that you will consider that while not always a politically popular thing to talk about reducing the rolls of registered sex offenders, that in the long run we think it would greatly improve community safety to concentrate our resources on those who pose the greatest risk to the community. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Neely, and we welcome Detective Diane Webb.
Good morning, and thank you for having all of us here today. I wanted to talk about the practical application of enforcing and monitoring registered sex offenders in the community. I think the Los Angeles Police Department and the offenders in our jurisdiction is a good illustration of some of the struggles that law enforcement encounters in not only registering but verifying the information that registrants are giving us as to where they're living. Our registrants are increasing, our numbers of registrants at a rate of 5 to 6% each year. We currently have about 5,100 registered sex offenders within the boundaries of the Los Angeles Police Department. And while most of the time those individuals who are on parole or probation get all the press and get all the attention, the real point here is that 75% of registered sex offenders are under no type of formal supervision at all once their supervisory period ends. And so the lifetime supervision, if you will, falls to local law enforcement. And this has only come to the forefront with the aftermath of this information becoming public information back in the 90s, that law enforcement is starting to focus on it. Because the bottom line is, if we're not verifying the information that the registrants are giving us, then the information that the public is seeing on Megan's Law is useless. It's not accurate, it's not current, and the individuals that they think are in their communities maybe aren't. Maybe they're lying about it, and if there's no enforcement effort, then there's no teeth behind the law and the purpose of registration in the first place. The burden on law enforcement is that now it's a new mandate, really, to enforce this, and a lot of agencies really don't address it at all. And the agencies that do, we're always vying for the same resources, the same personnel to cover a new type of enforcement. LAPD has anywhere from 700 to 1,000 registration transactions per month, and we struggle with individuals who are coming in from other jurisdictions because of residency restrictions in other cities, and so they tend to migrate to the point of least resistance and register with our city. And we absorb those individuals also, and actually have had instances where more housing opportunities are coming up in our city, but then of course it's more of a strain on our own resources. We have calculated that a single registration, not a brand new registrant, but just someone who's registering, for example, a transient who has to register once a month, takes about 3 hours of law enforcement work, with the registration itself, with collection of DNA, with photographing the registrant and their vehicle, gathering that information to use in future crime solving. And then the processing of the paperwork itself, the copying, the imaging, the storing of documents, the making the documents available for use in criminal prosecution. So it's very time intensive, it's very resource intensive, but it serves a great purpose to gather that information so that you know who the offenders are in the area. But important is to know what an assessment level is so that we can, if you will, triage and focus more specifically our enforcement efforts on those that truly need it, so that we aren't taking this shotgun approach, if you will, with 5,100 offenders and trying to figure out which ones need more close scrutiny, because right now we really don't know. Without assessment of all our registrants, we rely on what information we have at our fingertips, which a lot of times is not a lot, and we've taken it upon us to try to dig into their past history, which a lot of times can involve looking at court cases, trying to find court documents from decades ago. So not only is there the current registration and the component of also public notification, we need to know what type of assessment risk, what risk factors there are in order to adequately and competently inform the public about the offenders that maybe they should be watching out for a little bit more. So the recommendations of the board are really a great path for us to take in fine-tuning enforcement efforts as far as registered sex offenders in the community. Thank you.
Thank you, Detective Webb. You've got your hands full. Dr. Tobin, you're going to talk to us about treatment? You're going to...
I will. Thank you.
Very good. Welcome.
So on the board, Sex Offender Management Board, I represent individuals in California, professionals who provide sex offender treatment and assessment, also some who provide supervision and other services. I want to focus on sex offender treatment, and I'd like to highlight 5 points about sex offender treatment. Number 1, what it is and what it isn't. Number 2, does it work? One of the big questions. Number 3, how does it work? Number 4, the California situation with regard to treatment. And number 5, some concluding remarks. So, sex offender treatment, what it is, what it isn't. It is not a standalone strategy for sex offender management, but it's an element in a larger criminal justice system response. And that it's a part of that response that works within the containment model. Again, the diagram that you have. Treatment is not coddling sex offenders. It is not psychotherapy to help them feel better. It's tough. It demands a lot. Most sex offenders don't like it, at least at first. It forces them to look at and change major parts of themselves and how they think and how they act. Sex offender treatment isn't a cure. It isn't magic. It doesn't have the desired outcome on every offender. But what does? Rather, it teaches them tools for self-awareness and self-management and increases their responsibility and their motivation to self-manage. Sex offender treatment is an intervention with one goal: no future victims. It's an intervention that reduces the risk for future reoffending. Sometimes it seems amazing when you think about it, but for most sex offenders, entering treatment is the first and only time that anyone has ever talked directly to them about their crime, what they did, how it happened, and what they need to change so they never do it again. Treatment results in changes in the offender that can be long-lasting. In fact, it is the only sex offender management strategy that really looks toward the longer-term future of that offender, looks to his future life after treatment and other intense supervision ends. So, does this sex offender treatment work? This question, and the answer is certainly in the context of the larger conversation about what works, nothing works, the whole controversy that swirled for 30 or more years around correctional intervention. But today, the research is increasingly clear. Sex offender treatment does work. It does reduce recidivism. It does reduce new victimizations, and that is the goal. There are many studies now and some big meta-analyses which look at whole groups of studies. There's a 2008 review of the treatment of 22,000 sex offenders in 80 separate studies. For the untreated offenders, the recidivism was 17%. For those treated, 11%, a difference of 6%, but an actual reduction in recidivism of 37%. A 2009 analysis looked at 23 studies. Recidivism was 19% for the untreated, 11% for the treated, difference of 8%, a reduction of 43% in reoffending. And each of these studies points out better treatment produces even better than average results. So it's extremely important to do treatment right, to do it in the larger context, the containment model that's operating as it should. How does sex offender treatment work? It's usually mandatory. It requires the force of the criminal justice system for someone to enter treatment. It involves movement from an offender being externally motivated, you have to do this, to being internally motivated, which is a change that most of them do make. They enter resistant and kicking, and then gradually engaged and appreciative. Treatment and containment strengthen and intensify external control while they build internal control. External control is absolutely necessary, but as we see in headline cases and in many other cases, control has its limits, external control. So we need to try to be building this internal control, self-control, and it's possible and it works. Noncompliance with treatment is, of course, an immediate risk signal. It notifies those involved in the containment team that something is going on here. If we relate this, for example, to the Garrido case, I think if he had been in intensive specialized treatment, people would have become concerned. People would have read the risk signals. There would have been team communication. There would have been the post-conviction polygraph for sex offenders. There would have been an intensified focus, and hopefully there would have been apprehension. Sex offender treatment follows the principles of risk, need, and responsivity that have now been well established as the effective guiding principles in correctional programming. Treatment in the community involves 1 or 2 or more meetings for 1.5 hours of group therapy per week. There are many variations. How long does it last? It lasts till they're finished. In reality, for many, it's the duration of their supervision. For some, it's less than that. And for others, they're not finished when their formal supervision ends. So some might require longer treatment, which would require longer supervision. For some, perhaps lifetime. Treatment is curriculum-driven. It's not just offenders coming in and talking about what they think they want to talk about today. It focuses on key themes related to risk and risk reduction. So, sex offender treatment must be seen as part of a system, and it must be a part of the containment approach. And it must include and work with the clinical polygraph. What are the major themes that treatment must focus on to actually reduce the risk of reoffending? These are issues that are called dynamic risk factors or criminogenic need factors, jargon in the field. And we know from research that these are factors associated with reoffending, the same factors that the Soratso identifies, the risk assessment tool, and these are the ones that can change and can be changed through effective treatment. So what are they? The main ones are offense-supportive attitudes and beliefs, cognitive thinking errors, victim awareness and victim empathy, taking responsibility for the offense and for one's behavior, self-awareness, self-monitoring skills, emotional self-regulation, problem-solving skills, sexual arousal awareness and self-management, social skills, intimacy and relationship skill deficits, and social support systems. Number 4, what is the current reality regarding sex offender treatment in California? In California today, treatment, of course, can only be required for those under the formal supervision of the criminal justice system. So that includes those in prisons, those in jails, those on parole, those on probation. In CDCR prisons, about 22,500 sex offenders. At this point, there is no formal treatment for any of them. Apparently, there is planning being undertaken right now to perhaps create some treatment. On-state parole after prison, 6,000 to 7,000 sex offenders, perhaps half, a little less than half, are high risk, according to the Soratso assessment. At this point, there is almost no formal specialized treatment. Some very limited services at parole outpatient clinics. There were some specialized contracts with community-based providers. Those are not in force at the moment. There may be some planning to reintroduce those. In county jails, we don't even know how many sex offenders are there. We do know that, as far as we know, there is no treatment. And on county probation, perhaps 10,000. Very mixed and unclear picture because some counties do an excellent job and some counties do a very mixed job, little or nothing. In California, Treatment and containment has been recommended again and again. In 1999, the Legislative Analyst's Office put out an excellent report. Unfortunately, most of it would read still as true today as when it was put out in 99. The Governor's High-Risk Sex Offender Task Force in 2006, one of the primary recommendations was treatment. California Sex Offender Management Task Force in 2007, treatment. California Sex Offender Management Board that you see before you, treatment. And the National Center for Sex Offender Management, funded by the United States Department of Justice, recommendation, treatment. So the importance of treatment should not come as a surprise to California policymakers. A few final points. Number one, it's nearly impossible to provide effective treatment to homeless sex offenders. Many, many reasons. One, very simple, they come in and they can't stay awake. Number two, sex offender treatment must be done well and done within the containment model that's operating properly to be really effective. Anything could be called treatment, but unless it's done right, it's not effective. Community treatment during parole and probation has a greater impact than simply treatment while in custody. Of course, both in sequence are the desired model. Who should pay? We believe that the offender should pay as much of the costs of treatment as is possible. And finally, and I guess if I have one message that I'd like you to remember, it's this, that when compared with the various other sex offender management strategies that we use, that we've discussed in the report, all of which have their place, registration, community notification, internet posting, GPS tracking, residence restrictions, that have been so widely adopted and funded in California, treatment is the only one of these interventions that has research supporting its efficacy in reducing future reoffending. In every other case, the research we have now, nationwide, international, shows no effect on recidivism. And yet, the only one of these strategies that is not required by law and not funded is treatment and containment. Would containment and team communication and treatment and polygraph made a difference in the Garrido case? That's too much to promise with certainty, of course, but it definitely seems much more likely that such an approach would have made a difference than any other strategy for sex offender management that we know about. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tobin. These are sobering reports from each of you. And our last presenter in this panel, we'd like to welcome Chief Probation Officer from Stanislaus County, Jerry Powers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Happy to be here. Also happy to see members from the fiscal side of the Senate here. I will fight the urge to ask for more money. I'm not sure I'll be successful, but
We have a tax we like, vehicle license.
I'd like to briefly touch on a couple of points contained in the KSOM report that relate to the use of GPS technology in community supervision and housing, certainly that are important to us in the community corrections field. Technology is not a replacement for sufficient numbers of properly trained and equipped community supervision personnel, including probation and parole officers. Significant additional state resources have been committed for additional technology and personnel for state-supervised sex offenders. We're all aware of that. No additional personnel or technology resources, however, have been provided for county probation supervision of sex offenders. And I would note that there are nearly twice as many registered sex offenders in the state of California on probation supervision as there are on parole supervision. I would say, given that and the lack of local resources, it is just as likely that myself or one of my fellow chiefs from anywhere in this state could be sitting here before you answering the same questions that I'm sure you're going to have for Secretary Kate with respect to the Garrido case. The state of sex offender supervision is not a science, it's an art in many instances. We use phrases like evidence-based and things like that. I think Ms. Neely did a very accurate description of what that really means. When we're talking about actuarials, it is not a perfect science. It is an art, and it still requires the personal intervention of corrections professionals, treatment professionals, law enforcement professionals. GPS technology can be a very effective supplement to offender supervision strategies employed by both probation and parole. It is an ineffective replacement. As practitioners and policymakers, we have a responsibility to ensure that we do not oversell this technology to the public. The GPS technology does not prevent offenders from reoffending. It cannot immobilize an offender. It can't report to the supervision authority that an offender is engaged in illegal acts. It simply reports the location of the equipment at a point in time, no more, no less. It is up to the supervision officer to use their training and expertise to ascertain whether the activities of the offender at that location, at that point in time, are in compliance or not. An unfortunate but necessary byproduct of GPS is the tremendous amount of data that must be processed by that supervision officer. This requires much smaller supervision ratios and can result in a significant amount of time spent deciphering non-relevant data that could be distracting officers from more obvious indicators of non-compliant behavior. Literally, the search for the needle in the haystack, or the Dorito, if you may. It is for this reason that many have argued that GPS technology should be reserved for those at highest risk, myself included. In fact, I would submit that GPS technology is most appropriately deployed on only the high-risk offender. To utilize this technology on offenders who are assessed at low risk levels is, practically speaking, an overly expensive and inefficient use of resources that, frankly, we cannot afford. I would submit that given limited resources, public safety would be better served by spreading the technology to offender populations where in many instances location is a direct indicator of criminal behavior, such as high-risk domestic violence offenders, stalkers, gang members. In my county, we have chosen to utilize our GPS technology in just that manner. We have seen significant behavior changes in these additional populations. We've not increased the number of units we deploy. We've simply chosen to use those units in a targeted fashion on those at highest risk versus simply blanketing an entire category of offender regardless of risk. Due to limited time, I will not even touch on the issue of responsibility for lifetime GPS monitoring of paroled sex offenders once they complete their parole terms. Lastly, the issue of placement and housing of sex offenders, as outlined in the report, is particularly problematic. Residency restrictions have made locating and securing suitable housing for sex offenders extremely difficult. While the general sense is that society is not terribly concerned when sex offenders have difficulty locating acceptable housing, community corrections personnel, treatment providers, and researchers will tell you that unstable housing can actually increase the risk of reoffending for some sex offenders. While on the surface, the issue of keeping sex offenders from living in proximity to schools and other areas where children are might seem to make the public safer, it appears that the mechanism we have chosen to do this might in fact make the public less safe. It would seem that approaching the issue from the perspective of addressing individual offender types and restrictions, or looking at loitering restrictions versus residency restrictions, might be a better approach from a public safety perspective. Practically speaking, the current system that allows individual jurisdictions to set their own standards makes enforcement by probation, parole, and local law enforcement extremely difficult, if not impossible. In closing, the sex offender population is not a group that our society is particularly ready to embrace and allow to return to our neighborhoods. Practically speaking, however, the vast majority are going to return to those neighborhoods at some point. It is our job as public safety professionals to advise you, the policymakers, on the best ways to allow for that transition in a constitutional manner that minimizes the potential for future victimization. As a member of the KSOM, I believe that there's information contained in this report that will help to steer you and us towards, on that course. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Powers, and thank all of you for not only the fine presentation today, but for all the hard work that I know you put into this board, and I think the public should know this is all volunteer effort on your part, so it is no small gift that you give to us. I know my colleagues have questions. I have more than I know what to do with or where to begin. But what I think from a broader perspective is of great concern, at least to me, is that, let's be gracious and suggest that out of good intentions, the worst unintended consequences have been delivered to us. Great that California took the lead in 1947 with registration for sex offenders, showing good leadership, but over time now to see that we have 90,000 registered sex offenders, and the number's only going to continue to grow because, as you point out, only one of 4 states that requires lifetime registration. You had suggested, Mr. Powers, that we not oversell the benefits of GPS and new technologies, except we did exactly that with Proposition 83, Jessica's Law. We suggested to the public that if we only restrict where they live and make sure that these people are wearing GPS devices forever, even though we didn't know quite how that was going to work once they were no longer charges of the state, or who was going to pay for it, that everything would be fine. And now we've got reports and data and all that we need that tells us, at least from what I'm hearing you tell us today, is that the components of Prop 83 are not those components that will actually keep our communities safer. That if we had potentially revisited the requirements of lifetime registration, revisited how we better house, and it's not an easy question to be answered, I don't take it lightly, because we know that housing instability, and then, of course, as Dr. Tobin has told us, treatment at the top of the list, we actually could keep our communities and our families safer. So how we untie this knot now, I can tell you, is not going to be easy. At the time that Jessica's Law was making its way through this legislature, unsuccessfully, prior to it being put on the ballot with the gathering of signatures, I had dared to offer some alternative suggestions through some legislation which dealt with trespassing and loitering restrictions as opposed to residency restrictions. And the California Democratic Party, so not some fringe group of crazies, but I'm going to be the party itself put out a press release that said that I was a danger to society. This was their wording, and pure evil. This was the words of the party. So for one to even suggest other than what was put forward in Jessica's Law can bring great political risk. And so again, I don't know how to begin unwinding all of this. I do want to ask very specifically with regard to GPS, and I know that we're going to hear from Secretary Kate soon about what percentage of our sex offenders are actually homeless at this point. We know the numbers are very high, percentages are very high. How does GPS work if you've got to, don't you have to recharge it at night? You're living outdoors, you have no home. How does that even work?
Well, I can't speak for the parole department, but typically what will happen from a probation perspective if somebody doesn't have a residence is they'll report to the probation office to charge their unit. Or any other place that they can get access to. We get the technology will give you an indicator that the battery is going low on the GPS. It will give the offender as well as the probation officer a message. So we know when the battery dies on it, for instance, and if we see that it's repeatedly dying, sometimes that's an indicator that residency may be an issue because they can't plug in. So we'll accommodate them in our lobbies, allow them to plug in the lobbies and things like that. I do want to, I'm not arguing, I don't want to leave the impression that I don't support the use of GPS. I just want the public to understand that this is not some whiz-bang technology that is the cure for sex offenders or domestic violence offenders, but it's extremely labor-intensive, extremely expensive to use. So if I had my druthers, would I rather have everybody on GPS? Absolutely. But I don't have the personnel to follow all of those dots. They would be sitting at their desk 24/7 looking at dots. What do the dots mean? So it has its place, but in today's fiscal climate, the place is very, very limited. And I'm reluctant as a probation chief to go and put that limited GPS unit on an offender that is less likely to reoffend than, say, somebody who's out there who's stalking or has something like that. I want to deploy the technology where it's most appropriate and most effective.
Thank you for the clarification. The report actually says GPS monitoring had little effect on parolee recidivism. Your words actually in your presentation were a little stronger, that it does not prevent recidivism.
Well, there really isn't a whole lot of research out there because GPS technology is so new that says it does improves or is a detriment to recidivism. All GPS does is tell us where the person is, actually more accurately where the monitor is. We're assuming that it's still attached to the leg. So what they're doing, what they're thinking, who's with them, those types of things, we're not privy to that unless we're standing there.
I think the key is that GPS information has to be taken in context. Right. I think, one of the salient points in the Inspector General's report was about Garrido was saying, well, look he was in his yard all the time. Well, without context, most people would say, I would rather have him in his yard than by a water park or a school or a whatever. I mean, it requires how that information is being used by people who have appropriate levels of training and have appropriate interaction. If you've got a bunch of people sitting in front of monitors watching tracks all day, that is going to give you a very incomplete picture of what the daily activities or routines of a particular offender might be. Those people also need to be sort of on the ground, close by, interacting, speaking to, walking around, doing all of those sort of living things that require supervision. And that's why we keep talking about sort of containment as this multidimensional thing, that the GPS information is being looked at by the treatment providers and by law enforcement and by the supervising folks, and that they're sort of using that as a part of how they supervise, as opposed to, I think, the rhetoric that has sort of saturated into the public, which is this idea that, pay the $16 a day for GPS, and that somehow then suspends the need for everything else. It can enhance an infrastructure, but if the infrastructure isn't there, then what it does is it creates a lot of data that's difficult to use and doesn't necessarily tell you much.
So we're pouring all this money into GPS, which we know has little impact on rates of recidivism.
If that information stands alone without everything else, no, the information isn't as useful. I mean, just like Mr. Powers was saying, it can be very helpful in certain contexts, but there has to be sort of that infrastructure in order to use it. It's not the one thing that should be sort of, the guiding light of how to manage sex offenders. Can it help? Sure. And with some populations, we've been very clear to say you should be using GPS on them. But that gets diminished and marginalized and watered down as you watch other parts of that infrastructure fall apart. If you don't have enough people supervising, if you're not also making sure people are getting into treatment, or if you don't have law enforcement on the ground being able to check monitoring, that's where then the data becomes less useful. So it's not that, again, GPS is necessarily a terrible thing to use or one that you can't deploy strategically, but if it's being deployed in lieu of all of these other things, then it becomes really difficult and a lot less useful.
Thank you. Ms. Neely, I had a question for you, and I know my colleagues have questions too, so I will try to keep this brief. If we are scoring risk assessments now, why is it that difficult or expensive just to put that information up on the Megan's website?
On the public website? The Department of Justice has been working on a new software system that will put the information on the law enforcement side of the website, not on the public side, starting this summer when the new software gets implemented. So for the people that we do have scores for, which is, as you heard, about a third of the entire population, law enforcement at least will be able to see what the scores are. There is kind of mixed opinion on whether it's a good idea to put that information on the public side. I think it was considered by this committee in 2006 when risk assessment was enacted in SB 1128, and at that time I believe the experts were saying the public might not have a context for it, but I think that there's certainly an argument to be made that the public would like to know who's higher and who's lower risk to the extent that you can educate them about what that means. It doesn't necessarily mean that a low-risk offender will never reoffend, just like it doesn't mean that a person who's high risk is going to reoffend. So it's a little education is required along with the score.
I think we also debated whether we wanted to put the date of last offense on the website for the public as well. That would seem to be less complex than having to understand what a risk assessment rating means. As I just look on the website and say last offense 1981.
Right. DOJ opposed...
Maybe I don't get so upset that individual is living 3 blocks from me.
Yeah, DOJ opposed that for a long time because if that person last convicted in 1981 just got out of prison in 2010, let's say.
Well, you put both up then.
Exactly. So there was a bill passed 2 years ago that said to the extent DOJ can obtain the date of release, then we will also post the date of conviction, and that is to begin with the new software this year.
And that's just for law enforcement or for the general public?
No, that's for the general public.
That's for the general public. I hadn't been on Megan's site for a while. I went on last night to my zip code, and there was the little blue box for an individual in between 2 schools, just a couple blocks away. And so I clicked further, and it said, it had a disclosure line that read something like, this individual may no longer be at this address, which seemed to be rather useless information and now has upset me. Why are we doing that?
It says that on every single offender because there is a high incidence of moving without notifying local law enforcement that they've moved. And we don't want Joe Q. public who may have vigilante instincts to target a citizen living at a particular address on the website when a third party may have moved in and the sex offender may be long gone, unbeknownst to local law enforcement. So it actually says that on every single sex offender.
And given that with the passage of Jessica's law, that person by law cannot live, as the map was indicating, and it says, gives the disclosure, how is it we're communicating that there's potentially a sex offender living in a place where the law says he can't live?
Well, Prop 83 2,000-foot limitation is, at least in the opinion of the Attorney General and most district attorneys, not enforceable against people who are no longer on parole or probation supervision because it failed to create a separate crime for not obeying that law, failed to create a penal code offense.
Right.
And so because there's no enforcement mechanism, it's currently being enforced mostly by parole, and probation has also on occasion enforced it when they think it's appropriate in a particular offender's case by revoking parole or probation. But there is no enforcement mechanism otherwise. If there were, the transient rates, which shot through the roof for parolees because they are the ones, the main group having the law applied to them, we might be in the situation that Iowa was, in which when they started applying their similar residency restriction to all of their registered sex offenders, they went from a 95% compliance rate to less than 50% compliance with the registration requirements.
I remember that well as Jessica's law was moving through our committee, that the Iowa District Attorneys Association was pleading with the legislature to please repeal the residency restrictions that legislation wanted to impose, and finally Prop 83 did impose on California. We don't indicate whether an offender is on parole, probation, or not on the site, do we?
No, we do not, because...
would that be helpful?
Well, the sex offender, it would be helpful, I think, but the sex offender registry doesn't have ready access to that information because there is no... Correct me if I'm wrong, Jerry. There is no 58-county database for probation that would tell me every probationer. Parole does have a database called Parole Leads, but the database software doesn't talk to the sex offender registry DOJ software, so we don't have an easy way to do that.
Thank you. And I cut you off. I'm sorry, Ms. Brown McBride, and then we'll go on to Senator DeSaulnier.
Well, and I think that this is one of the perennial problems of how the public intersects with this information. They heard with the passage of Prop 83 that all sex offenders are going to be precluded from living near schools or parks, when the answer to that is actually much more complicated, that there were already a good number of offenders who were in the community before the passage of the law, and there's a bunch of parsing about sort of who specifically this means, but that the law doesn't apply to them. There are others that now the argument is that the law doesn't apply to folks who have rolled off of supervision because there's no ability to sort of convict under that. And so the public has this sort of general idea that all 90,000 or actually 65,000 in the public are subject to the same law, and it's simply not the case. And so you see all the time people running the Megan's Law site saying, but I don't understand why I see here versus here, and we don't have the ability to help distinguish that. In fact, I think that the courts are still trying to discern that themselves. But I think you brought up Iowa just a minute ago, and I think they give an interesting lesson for the state of California. Iowa was one of the first places to pass the broad residency restrictions, much to the consternation of their district attorneys and victims advocates and a variety of other folks, and recently passed a law to step back from some of those residency restrictions and try to re-examine loitering restrictions and a variety of other things. I mean, it is very, very difficult to step back from some of these laws. It's very difficult to sort of have a political climate that says, in the interest of public safety, we are rethinking these things. And that's how the management board tried to approach it, to say, in the interest of public safety, it's clear that having 5,000 transient sex offenders in the state of California does not make us net safer. And so in doing that, part of what we've asked the legislature and policymakers to be thinking about is there something, is there some guidance that we can get from how other states have thought about this, or from the data that we're generating inside of this state to say, how do we rethink this in the interests of public safety and in the interests of decreasing victimization?
Thank you. I remember scratching my head when the author and proponents of the residency restrictions were moving forward, and when this issue of prospective, retroactive was raised. I think he made mention that, no, it is indeed just prospective, which then indicates, well, these folks are so dangerous that in the future, if they offend, we'll keep them 2,000 feet from our schools and parks. But they've already offended, well, we'll let them stay where they are. So it didn't make sense to me. Senator Saulnier.
Thank you, Senator Leno. More in the macro, at least there's this perception, I think, in the public that these kind of crimes have exponentially increased. And we know, for instance, with domestic violence, that there's a very good argument that they didn't necessarily, that because of reporting requirements and the realization by all of us as a culture that these things were happening. So we mentioned 1947, sort of a trigger, I think, in many ways, where both in the political perspective and the public optics is, if we could only go back to those happy days of two-income patriarchal families, everything was better. So maybe any of you, just has it become exponentially worse? Is there something larger at work here in your work that, not just how we apply the prevention, but is there something else going on out there, or is it just the realization that these things happen, or a combination of the above?
I can take the first shot at it, and I'll look to my board members to help me out if I miss something. I think, how's this for ambivalence? I think the answer is yes and no.
Oh, thank you. That sounds like the kind of answer we would get.
No, I'm done. I'll leave now. What we've learned with some of the incidence data around when we've done nationwide studies around sort of what are people's experiences with sexual victimization, what does it look like in terms of things like CPS reporting and all of that, we're actually seeing the number of sexual assault victims decrease some. Now, the lived experience of people at rape crisis centers and at hospitals and all of that is that they are still exceedingly busy, because this is still a very underreported crime, and there are a lot of systems that are still really busy engaging it. What I think we are learning, though, is the myriad of ways that this crime occurs. We didn't talk about things like human trafficking 10 years ago. We didn't talk about incest 25 years ago. We didn't talk about, interpersonal crimes or near-peer sexual violence or things like that. And so we're getting a lot more clear about how pervasive it is, and also the ways that that works itself out in culture. And so I think the way that then the public perceives that is that there's this, that there is an increase in the incidence of it. I'll tell you, as an advocate and as a victim's advocate, I'll certainly say that there is an epidemic of sexual violence in California and across the nation. In our lives, it's very difficult for you to be able to look at any group of people you know without having them been touched by or experienced sexual violence. At the same time, though, I think what we've tried to do is to learn more specifically how it plays out. And in doing that, we've also learned a lot more about offenders. The age of the internet, the age of a lot of other things have helped us understand ways that people prey on other people that give us the impression that it's exponentially increasing. So we struggle with sort of these two realities that, from what people are telling us, the experience of victimization seems to be dropping in some ways, which I think speaks to some good things that we've been doing. I don't want to make it sound like there's been no advances. Obviously, Dr. Tobin was talking about treatment. We have created tools and training for law enforcement. These things have all made a difference. At the same time, though, we're also learning about how pervasive some of this is and having to develop more comprehensive and complex systems. And so that's the tension I think we exist in when we try to do sex offender management work, is how do we look at the complexity of how it plays out in society and talk about that in a way that actually informs the public and doesn't just terrify them.
But I think the other part of the answer to your question has to do with how the public perceives what's going on. And it's what we would call stranger danger. The public, seeing these high-profile, horrible kidnapped cases of children, is afraid. They're afraid their child is going to be kidnapped off the street. Those are the cases that are played up in the media. That's the reason I mentioned the Black Dahlia case generated the original registration law, because subsequent cases have scared the public. I don't know that we have a hugely increased sexual victimization, but I do know that we have so much media saturation over the kidnap sexual events that result in homicides especially. They're so horrifying that what they don't realize is the true danger lies in the people they know. It's the family members, it's the acquaintances of the family that do about 90% of the child molesting, and it's an education issue that we have not been able to address adequately with the community.
Interesting. Anyone from law enforcement?
Well, I would agree with exactly what they said, in that, and you touched on it too, with the domestic violence reporting requirement. We saw spikes in those incidents. The technology is our friend, and at the same time, it can be the thing that just whips us about the head and shoulders, whether it be the Dugard case or Jessica or Marcy, or we tend to be driven in those ways when those events happen, and we adopt policies, we adopt practices in my department based on failures that we've seen. I'm sure Secretary Kate is going to talk about that. So we tend to respond because of the nature of some of these events. I don't know that it means that they're more prevalent, but I would agree that it means that we're certainly hearing more about them because of the nature of media and internet and on-demand video and those kinds of things. So.
On the, a lot of discussion here about doing more cost-benefit analysis on legislation, and it's largely from the other side of the aisle. It strikes me this would be also an appropriate, although I agree with the idea that, at least in my experience on a regulatory board, when I was on the Air Resources Board, for all this criticism, we were required to do cost-benefit for the regulations, whether those were completely accurate or not. So if we did cost benefits for some of the laws, and to be perfectly honest, in the political world, this goes back to the Dukakis-Bush campaign when Willie Horton happened, and it's a very strong symbol that, and it was a horrible crime, and we've just heard that similar sort of thing here in Sacramento on release. So given that those are things that we should be concerned about as policymakers, but if we could be driven more by evidence as opposed to action, as your comments in the beginning, how would we do that? Could we actually require that of laws in this field? I suppose we could. And then, have there been studies about the true cost of of these crimes on a larger society? So, for instance, on page 16, you talk about childhood victimization is a significant predictor of adult arrests for alcohol and/or drug-related offenses. So, when you go beyond just the incident and the victim, for the rest of that victim's life, the probability of requiring some kind of help or helping themselves by self-medicating. In your work around the country, around the world, is there some kind of sort of secondary cost as well? So there's the actual cost of trying to stop these things from happening and protecting the public from criminals who have already been adjudicated and found guilty of it, but then there's a secondary cost, which strikes me to go back to the first question I asked, maybe has a relationship with at least the idea that this is getting to be a larger problem, not a smaller problem.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the impact of victimization on the first-person experiencers of that victimization, yeah, there are enormous costs, and there have been some studies done by the World Health Organization and by the Centers for Disease Control and other folks that have looked at what victimization costs in terms of either how to do an effective intervention when those resources are available, and in California those resources are more under stress than ever before, or the cost of intervening with that if you don't. What happens to the child who's molested who then goes on to drink or who then goes on to have other types of criminal behaviors. Similarly, I think there's an enormous cost to the families that are connected to those victims. Either if it happens inside of a family, say it's like a sibling sexual assault, there's enormous cost to it impacts on parents and non-offending parents and other types of caregivers or systems that are trying to identify this, or even the cost on schools. There's been other high-profile cases here in California that's very clear that school systems and counseling systems are under enormous amount of stress and speculation about the resources that they should or shouldn't be putting into these programs. And so it has a ripple effect throughout all of those systems. There's never been an exhaustive study in that sense, but it is interesting that sometimes when we think about, we pass a lot of legislation sort of in the name of victims of sexual assault. And I think rightly we memorialize those individuals, and we rightly memorialize that tragedy. Very rarely in any of those laws do we actually create resources for those victims. Very few hours, if you look at some of the most recent legislation passed in the state, there were no new crisis lines created. There were no additional hours of counseling provided. Victims weren't able to access resources in any different way than they were 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago. And in fact, for rape crisis centers in the state of California, we receive about $50,000 for the entire state in terms of what we do for the state. And the rest we rely on federal money that comes to California and then goes to our rape crisis centers. And so I think you really highlight, a disconnect between this idea of money that we put in the name of managing sexual offenders versus money that we put in the name of assisting victims. And if we were able to take, a more holistic approach, honestly, something that looks more like a containment approach, you look at both of those and figure out how are we managing those needs. And you might be able to say it would be more important to help this victim in this way, and that may actually be really important because it gets them out of a situation where they may be put at risk again, versus doing something else over here. We haven't yet been able to gain that kind of perspective in order to make those type of assessments.
And I guess just what I'm struggling for is I would like to be in a model where we were evidence-based as possible and not politically driven. And
Amen.
For us who believe in that, how are we measuring that? In my simple view, when we do things in government like, sorry for the analogy, but public works or, say, emergency response from public safety folks, whether they be fire or health or public safety, law enforcement folks, you can measure that fairly easily. You can measure it over time, you can measure it, and you can put it in contracts. In this instance, which is always the case in health and safety, how do you measure prevention over a period of time when you can't even say is the this isn't a criticism, but is the problem getting worse? Where's the base here? And for us to want to be driven by, and all your work is great, but I guess in the evolution of it is, for those of us who are politicians who want to be actually able to say that we voted for laws that we believe evidence-based will make our constituents safer, rather than responding to political consultants who I can't choose my words in this period of time, but somehow extort us to do things that may not actually be evidence-based. It's a struggle and an observation, and I look forward to having further discussions. Lastly, the struggle whenever we try to change things in government in coordination and implementation. So one thing, just looking at other states, they house these things in different places. As always, we don't have a public safety person at the state of California. How do we coordinate the implementation of your suggestions, knowing that all of these cultures, not because there's anything wrong within the cultures, but they're used to doing things a certain way, and it's very hard to change those cultures? For instance, around treatment.
Right. I think that's been one of the premier logistical challenges of the board's work. We spent the good first year trying to just map all of the various and sundry constituencies that were involved in doing sex offender management in California. The map is actually horrifying. It's large and complex, and that has to do with a large and complex and amazing state. That's simply some of what it means to be in California. But I think that's what the management board is at least trying to do, is to consolidate some of that. Now, are we the sole point for that? No, obviously not. But I think what we've tried to do is to at least identify what some of those mechanisms are. I think that honestly is some of the emerging sort of next pieces of the board's work, is to try to identify, where appropriate consolidations look like, or where it looks like, things could be done more efficiently and more effectively, because we have a tendency in the state to do a lot of local efforts that don't come up to the state, and we don't hear about necessarily in Sacramento, or we say a lot of things in Sacramento that don't necessarily resonate with the experience of people down at the local level. And we're very aware of that tension. That's why, other constituents on the management board are from the cities and the counties. We wanted them to be present and sort of available to speak to us. So I wish I had, really like a good, there's the guy that should be doing it, or there's the woman that should be leading it up. But, unless y'all have a name, that's something I think we struggle with.
Well, I'm sorry.
I think that the very formation of the Sex Offender Management Board, which the legislature and the governor did, created for the very first time a locus for all of these constituents to speak together. So that's wonderful, and yet we're also aware that we have few resources and no power except persuasion. So there is no place that we're aware of, and that is one of our dilemmas about where to bring things that we believe would make a difference other than here.
Well, I think you're doing a great job. It's not to belittle that. It's just try to figure out how we can help you. And timelines, I think, are important for all of us in terms of implementation. I remember watching CPS workers interview people in Antioch years ago, kids who they've pulled out between two filing cabinets, and then they open a child advocacy center. And, we know those things work, but it takes a long time to get them to do those things. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you for your patience, Senator Negrete-McLeod.
Okay, you guys left me no questions to ask. As I was listening to you, I was going to ask you a real question, but then my question is just going to be rhetorical. How do we, and I talk about we collectively in the legislature, past and present, how do we help you do your actual work? Because you have come up with really good things that make sense, as he talks about, empirical evidence that really would do that. How do we that, and I say we, and I'm not talking about these people here, but we that get driven by political outside stuff that seem to be constantly carrying bills that are more for the public's adoration as opposed to what actually makes sense. So how do we stop us? How do you all stop us? How do you?
Careful.
No, that's why I said it's rhetorical. How do you stop us from doing the lait du jour because it looks good outside? It's going to get us votes to whatever the hell we're running for, and so how do we do things that actually make sense to protect the public and without letting us be vulnerable to saying those words, soft on crime, or God, they care more for the perpetrator than the victim.
Right.
And so, God darn it, they asked all the questions, so I got to ask this question.
Can I respond to that?
Of course.
Okay. It's a great question, and I think we're starting to head down that path. I'm going to give kudos to Senator Leno for some legislation he put in last session, Senate Bill 678, which you need to create partnerships with your cities, your counties, your treatment providers, and things like that. But you have to make the fiscal case for it, which goes back to Senator DeSaulniers' point. If you look at the healthcare model is driven by the cost of service, the cost of disease, the cost to prevent disease. What's the benefit? Where's the, where does it pay off? You look at in the research that we're doing now in community corrections is headed down that identical path that healthcare went down 25, 30 years ago. You look at probably the most significant thing that we can look at comes from years ago. Society put a cost on what a positive tox baby meant. how much it was going to cost educationally, what it was going to cost from a social service perspective and all of that. And people started saying, wow, over $1 million. If we can prevent this baby from being positive tox at birth, we can save our health system, we can save our educational system. We need to do the same sorts of things when we look at policies dealing with public safety in communities. Does it make sense from a victim perspective? Does it reduce recidivism? What does it cost? And is society willing to pay the cost? Or does it return more than it costs? The Washington Institute for Public Policy has some great data on the return on investment for specific recidivism reduction programs. But I think that gives us as public safety professionals, because I certainly don't want to be portrayed as soft on crime. I'm right there with you. I don't feel that I'm soft on crime. However, in my opinion, soft on crime doesn't mean that I should be opposing programs that improve recidivism rates. To me, that is hard on crime and good for our public. It's not soft on crime to put offenders back in the community that have lower rates of recidivism. So it's kind of both of your questions. It's fiscal, but it's also policy, and it's public safety and community driven. So I think it's a great question, and I would say challenge me when I come to sit in front of you and I've got some great program that I'm looking for funding, whether it be for more probation officers. Show me the money, show me how it's going to get paid for, and show me how society is going to benefit, and then put it on the scales and let's see if it really does make sense.
Unfortunately, though, when I remember a few years back when the 3 strikes was going to be on the ballot, and it was polling like this, that we really wanted change, and then our good governor got out there and said everybody was going to die in their house. You know, it suddenly switched like this. So the public is very swayed by whatever, and you talked about it, about that people become so afraid that they think that every child is going to be kidnapped because the newspapers are the ones that put this thing that scare the people. You know, every night, those TV things about, my husband is a former police officer, and he said, when I was on the force, you never had people chasing down the street that it became the news of the night, that you have it on for an hour and a half, somebody chasing somebody down the street. That's not what it was. The cops went to work, the newspaper did their thing, but it wasn't about how many people got killed today, how many people got... As you know, something gets the news and it gets like 5 days worth, and then it goes on to something else, and some other real important news doesn't even get heard because this is what's up there.
I think there are a couple concrete things, though. I mean, one is for folks working here in the legislature and in the governor's office and other folks, is that the management board sits ready to sort of help and be of assistance when people have questions. And there are several legislators who've taken us up on that offer, who have talked with us about bills or asked various questions of different experts that are with the management board or used our report as reference. I mean, part of the reason why we have been so prolific in terms of writing is that we've been trying to create some architecture so that policymakers can say, listen, it's not just my idea, that this is what the research looks like, this is what other sort of public safety practitioners, this is what people on the ground are saying works and doesn't work. And so I think we would still stand as ready and willing to be partners to legislators who are interested in talking through issues. We've had a lot of folks talking to us about residency restrictions or thinking about how to make those more effective. And engagement with the board at that level, I think, is something that we've really strived to do. I think the media culture is another very important part of this. And I can say that through my work on the management board and other folks that have on the management board, we've also been talking to media, and sometimes I think that the tone is changing a little bit. I'm not going to pretend that it's it's all fantastic and everybody's sort of embracing everything that we're talking about, but I can say that we've had some pretty interesting and complicated conversations about these things, and people are asking questions. And I think it takes the right information for people to start asking questions. 3 years ago when we were starting to talk about residency restrictions in California, I was laughed off of a radio show because people are like, how could you even suggest as a victim's advocate that it might not be a good idea to have a residency restriction? What is wrong with you? And I had that question asked more often than not. And then the numbers start coming out about transients. And we started seeing the numbers tick up and up and up, and it went from under 1,000 before the passage of Prop 83 to over 5,000 now. And now all of a sudden people are saying, wow, maybe something is going wrong. Maybe this isn't what we intended. And that the conversation is becoming, I think, a little more open. It is a glacial and gradual change. I mean, sadly, rethinking some policies takes far longer than it does to enact some of these policies. But I think that's one of the concrete ways that we've been trying to have this conversation so that policymakers and leaders can say it's safe to have the conversation, to be saying what should we redo, and also then what successes should we be celebrating. I mean, not all of this has gone poorly. There are some very good things that have happened in California in the last few years. The actuarial risk assessment piece, the creation of Sriracha, I mean, those have all been very important advancements in what California has done that we should be proud of. And so having public conversations about both of those things, I think, are really important. But it is hard to get that into a really snappy 24-hour news cycle. That is absolutely a challenge.
Ms. Neely, did you want to get the last word before we go on?
Can I have the last word? Thank you. I just want to say that the way the Iowa legislature last year was able to undo the residency restriction law that was not more carefully targeted and to enact more loitering restrictions in its place, except for high-risk child molesters who still are bound by the residency restrictions, was partnering with law enforcement and prosecuting attorneys throughout the state of Iowa who said to the legislature, we don't think this is making the state safer. The effects of this law have made us less safe, and having that partnership with the legislature and law enforcement and the DAs is how they got the law changed.
Well, thank you for igniting that conversation, Senator. It's a very valuable one. And I would like to think, as we conclude this panel and go on to the next, that wouldn't it be great if this legislature would digest your report, and I'm sorry more of my colleagues aren't here today, but I know staff is here, and hopefully we'll be delivering reports to them, and that we revisit residency restrictions and have a conversation as to maybe the loitering and trespassing restrictions make more sense, thereby reducing homelessness, that we would revisit the lifetime registration requirement and follow suggestion of other states that we may have tiers 1 through 4, using all of the money that we would save in the waste of the lifetime registration and invest it into victim services. And then additionally, limit GPS, as has been recommended, for just the high risk. And again, take those savings and invest in treatment, which we know actually will help keep our community safer. That's a dream that I have. So, and maybe your work will help move us in that direction. So I hope you will all stick around. Maybe you could spread out a little bit, because we're going to ask you to stay as we invite up the Secretary of the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, Matthew Cate, and Robert Ambriselli, who is the Director of the Division of Adult Parole Operations at CDCR, to lead us in lessons from the Garrido case. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Secretary Cate, would you like to begin?
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Senators. I just wanted to start by saying that I really appreciate the opportunity that this hearing provides to discuss this matter, and I also appreciate the work of the Sex Offender Management Board. Having reviewed their report and having met with the executive director and discussed it, I think that it's obviously much needed and contains some excellent work. So I wanted to make sure that the committee understood that. We are committed to addressing the population of sex offenders both in the prisons and on parole under the core principles that are laid out by this board. That being said, we are nowhere close to doing so as of yet. Some basic facts: we have about 8,750 sex offenders on active parole. About 2,200 of those are homeless, transient. Another 900 are parolees at large. We have approximately 2,200 of those offenders that are on active parole on GPS, active GPS, another 4,800 on what's what's sometimes called passive GPS. I would like, if I could, to just talk about a few of the lessons learned in the follow-up of Garrido, and then I'm also available to discuss the recommendations of the SOM board, and of course to take your questions. With me is Robert Amberselli, who last month was appointed by the governor to be the director of parole in California. And he's available to answer questions as well. So a couple of key findings in the Garrido case that I think are particularly relevant here that I would like to discuss. One is regarding classification. The report notes that Garrido was improperly classified as a low-risk sex offender some 10 years ago or 11 years ago when he first came to California. And as you may know, we now assess every sex offender that leaves our prison system with a static 99 assessment to try to address that issue. Moreover, we've gone back and looked to see, are there any offenders who came from other states or who have transferred, or any offenders who have not been assessed? And as Mr. Amberselli can tell you, we've basically gone back and said we're going to treat all those as high-risk sex offenders until such time as they've been properly classified. And I think that we've now reached out to every sex offender and had those classifications completed. Another finding was related to obtaining key parole information from Garrido. As this committee may remember, Mr. Garrido did not come from out of a California prison for a California crime. He was transferred first from the federal government to Nevada, and then from Nevada to California when he moved here 10, 11 years ago. And his parole records were sparse as far as information concerning his past conduct. And so Mr. Amberselli can talk a little bit about what he's done in that regard. But in sum, we've started to put together a policy that would require at least some information from the transferring agency. Robert, do you want to talk just a little bit about what we're doing in that regard as far as requiring agencies to provide us with some information on parolees who transfer in?
Yes, good morning. Can you hear me? Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to testify this morning. There are a couple of policies that went out, and they're currently being vetted internally before they go to labor, and specifically they relate to the need for that information when it comes from outside, from interstate, and they're to pass it to us and the agent of record, including when they notice something on the federal rap sheet as well as a state rap sheet for a conviction out of state, are required to push for that information. Doesn't mean that the information always comes. Sometimes those states or the feds don't have that information, but the requirement will stand with the agent that they're to push to try to get that information.
Moving on to the next finding, and it's probably key to this hearing, is concerning GPS. The OIG found that the passive GPS monitoring program was ineffective and made the recommendation that we convert all offenders to active GPS, regardless of risk, or in the alternative, to provide to rework the current system regarding passive GPS. We don't agree with putting all offenders on active GPS regardless of risk level. However, we also don't think that our passive GPS system was particularly effective. And so we're taking a middle ground in which, as for those low-risk offenders who are currently on passive GPS, we would require that they go on an active GPS for some period each month. In other words, for 4 consecutive days each month, an agent will be watching their every move on active GPS, just so that we are able to find if there's a pattern of misconduct related to the location of that offender, that pops up, that there's some analysis, rather than just waiting for a crime to be occurred and to use GPS as a means of trying to solve that crime. It's not perfect by any means, but it allows us to at least let all offenders know that sometime during that month we will be tracking you. Our view is we don't have the resources to put everyone on active GPS, and it's also not effective, as this board has said, without truly a containment model. Also wanted to touch on just briefly a couple others. We have greatly improved the supervision of parole agents, primarily through creating a field-level supervisor. We're meeting with labor now on that proposal, which will create for the first time in California the sergeant's level of field supervisor, which should address the the Inspector General's concerns about supervision. As far as training, we're creating a field training officer position so that each new agent will learn from an experienced agent on the street how to most effectively do their job, which addresses the training issues that were raised in the report, and we're revamping our parole academy as well. And then, I think that's probably the main issues that I would address, other than the fact that as far as some of the other GPS concerns, one of the things that came out in the report is this offender, his GPS unit would activate on a regular basis, almost nightly. And what we learned, of course, is that due to the construction of his house, when he was inside the house, the equipment would malfunction. And so basically it really taught us two things. One is the GPS equipment isn't perfect, that technology is evolving. And two, we need to do a better job of managing our own expectations. So if you have a offender on GPS, some agents, for example, would utilize that to alarm the agent anytime the person left a particular zone, say 25 miles, even if that offender wasn't required to stay within that zone, just so the agent was aware of where that offender was. Well, what we've learned and what we're teaching our agents is we need to manage our expectations. So if we're going to set a policy on restricting movement, for example, and say you can't leave a 25-mile-an-hour zone, then we need to mean that and we need to enforce it. And if the alarm goes off, then we need to check that out and investigate it. And we shouldn't have so many restrictions that we can't possibly investigate them all. So more focused restrictions and better follow-up on each of the alarms that goes off. Robert, anything to add to that piece?
I think the only change is that parole has gotten better at understanding the technology. It takes time, like anything else. When you get something new, you have to learn, you have to understand. You go back and train again. You find that you've made either mistakes or room for improvement. And I think it's one of the things that that we've gone back and done. The technology's also gotten better. So as it improves, we're able to then focus on different things that in the past we didn't. For instance, as it starts to give the agent an opportunity to get better information on tracks, some of the things like drifting or information about over-reported information tends to go away, and that's just basically improvements in technology. A lot of it is like your cell phone. People just don't understand how it is that you can't get a GPS waypoint, but it's the same thing. If you step into an elevator in a 5-story building, you're going to lose your cell phone for a little bit of time, or your signal. The same type of thing happens with GPS technology, and as it improves, as our agents get better, and as we go back and retrain them, so does the technology get better, and so does our opportunity or ability to supervise people more effectively as well.
Moving to the Sex Offender Management Board recommendations, I would note that some of these recommendations we've taken on and are doing now, some we're not. So we do have, for example, a uniform definition of high-risk sex offender, and we are assessing our offenders 120 days before release using the static 99. We are not providing very much sex offender treatment in prisons. So we have a special group of offenders who are exhibitionists that are being provided with sex offender treatment, but it's a very small number. If you look at the reports that have come out on this issue, one of the things that's important is the safety of these offenders. In California, if you're a sex offender and general population inmate knows that, your safety can be at risk. And so it obviously de-incentivizes inmates to be a part of a sex offender treatment program. And so if you look at, for example, I met with my colleague from the director from Utah recently, and he was telling me that they have segregated their sex offenders in the last couple of years that they're in prison, and they provide treatment in a particular facility that's all sex offenders, and so they're able to keep those offenders safe in that way. One of the problems at being 190% of capacity is we don't have swing space. So to take and empty a 1,000-bed facility means I would have 1,000 offenders in hallways and dorms and gymnasiums or on buses while we moved 1,000 sex offenders into a segregated sex offender treatment. I think we have to go there at some point. That's what my security folks tell me, is that's probably necessary, and we just need to address the crowding problem before we're able to do that. On the issue of providing victims with notifying victims 90 days prior to anticipated release, we've implemented that recommendation, as to providing law enforcement with information. We do that as well already. Parole supervision of high-risk sex offenders, though, is something that we have not taken on. 2 years ago, the department led a contract for providing the containment model for high-risk sex offenders on parole. One of those contracts was let. That, as I understand it, that provider had a licensure problem, and so that part of the contract was canceled. The Inspector General conducted an investigation into some concerns about other providers. The long and short of it is, though, is that those contracts didn't happen. So what we've decided to do is re-let the contract, and so we should be providing IFB, requests invitation for bid, thank you. Within the next 30 days, that IFB will be done and will be provided to the treatment community, and hopefully we'll get bids. It's a contract that will provide for treatment of about 800 high-risk sex offenders on parole using the containment model. And so this committee should have in its hands the IFB within the next 30 days so that you can see that. Obviously, the need is much higher than that. We have some financial restrictions, obviously, at this point, but we thought it best, we've got to get started, and we're committed to doing that.
Secretary Kate, is it restrictions of finance or Prop 83 that would prohibit you from disinvesting in all of this expensive and yet to be shown effective GPS and putting it into parole supervision for high-risk sex offenders, or even treatment for that matter?
Well, the law requires that all offenders be strapped with GPS. And we actually did that for some offenders before, who were currently on parole before even they were required by law. But so we took an aggressive approach to GPS, I think, in our zeal to try to meet the expectations in Prop 83. But all offenders now are strapped, I believe, and that's according to state law.
You have no say in that matter. That's because of Prop 83.
That's right.
And do you know what the price tag for that is, as specifically related to Prop 83?
It's currently about $55 million, which includes staffing for GPS.
And that's just for the passive?
It's for everything right now.
And do you know how the passive and active break down in that $55 million?
It's roughly, no, I don't have the exact percentage. There are about 2,200 active GPS and about 4,700, give or take any day, passive GPS. The contract dollars vary just a little bit, but because you've got more of one group versus another, they tend to wash out. It's roughly about $250,000 per caseload of 40, or about $260,000 for the 20. So that's what you're looking at for about 20 offenders being supervised on GPS.
And remind the committee, if the passive is just watching the dots on the screen from a desk, the active is?
Actually, it's just the opposite. Active is watching the dots on the screen. Passive is waiting for an alert indicating that it's either something has gone wrong or, for example, that a crime has been committed, and then utilizing that data later to try to solve that crime or apprehend it.
But as was already pointed out, if you've got active GPS watch without the parole supervision, so you understand the context in which that dot's moving, as in the Garrido case, it really doesn't do much good at all, does it?
Well, we do supervise those offenders on active GPS, so we do both. We we obviously don't watch dots 24/7, but there is both a supervision component and viewing the dots, but usually that's done towards not as they happen, but that's done later. Robert, maybe you can explain what that's like.
So just to kind of put it into context, in the Sacramento area, an agent, you could have two different agents, one that's on active and one that's on passive GPS caseloads. So taking the 40 passive GPS cases, that agent would have those folks sprayed somewhere in the Sacramento area as far as maybe Sac South all the way down where Stockton comes up, and you could go as north as almost where Roseville borders. And so you're supervising those folks. There are a number of technical things that we do, home calls, urinalysis testing, all of those things. And on top of that, there's a track review. Typically, if we set a boundary and that person breaks that boundary, which is called an inclusion or an exclusion zone, that's when you start to get alerts. But you also get alerts in things like low charging. Or tamper alerts, and if you can imagine that that person's moving, sometimes they bump against something. Now, the piece that I talked about earlier about the technology getting better, so does the technology get better about the tampers or those types of alerts. But those are the alerts that come back to the agent, and when you've got 40 folks, you're actually trying to deal with, if you have 4 or 5 alerts a day times 40, I mean, you could have an excess of 100, 200 alerts in a day on top of navigating through traffic, going up and down Highway 80, doing your tests, going to board hearings.
Sounds like a lot of ways.
It can get very detailed and quite laborious.
Garrido is not getting the kind of supervision you just mentioned because he was misclassified as low rather than high risk?
That's right. When he was initially came to California using the old system, he was misclassified as low risk from the outset. And
you said there wasn't communication with the feds at that time, so
we got a little bit of information indicating that he had done a great job on parole and that they had at one point recommended his termination from parole. Right. But other than that, very little information. The final agent, I think it was the final agent, had actually noticed and had set up that Garrido to receive a static 99 assessment. Unfortunately, that was done just towards really close to his apprehension.
So the information you had from the feds was actually reassuring information, and then we did not give him our own assessment until you said...
Well, we did give him an assessment. It was done incorrectly by that agent 10 years ago, and he was assessed as low risk when he should have been high risk, even under the assessment then. My point is that an agent more recently noticed that he had the old assessment and ordered that he take the new assessment, the static 99, but that order came only just months before he was apprehended.
And what did that second assessment tell us?
I don't think he completed the second assessment, did he?
I think he came out.
Oh, he did. He came out as a high-risk sex offender.
And then was there a greater supervision, stepped-up supervision in that short period of time?
It was, as I recall, the results came back after he was apprehended.
The results came back afterward. Got it. Okay. Sorry to have interrupted.
No, that's okay. That coincided with the end of my prepared statement anyway, so I'm happy to take questions.
Could you talk about the homelessness issue that's been referred to as a result of this requirement of Prop 83 GPS on everybody?
Residency restriction.
And for that matter, the residency restrictions?
Yes. So as I mentioned, we have about 2,350 transient sex offenders. That's double the number of just a couple of years ago as far as the percentages go. It's about 27% of all offenders in California, sex offenders, are transient. Some counties obviously higher than others, so the highest being San Francisco at almost 84% transient.
Because of the nature of the density of the city.
Exactly. Very few places.
It's possible not to be within 2,000 feet of a school, a park, or where children congregate.
Exactly right.
And
so you find that in all major metropolitan areas, the numbers are much higher than they are elsewhere.
So as a result of that requirement of the 2,000-foot residency restriction, we see these extraordinarily high rates of homelessness. And then we've got the required expense of GPS on all of these people, for whom GPS is the least effective because they're homeless and they just can't comply.
Right, and then as Mr. Amberselli said, we have housing costs associated as well. As during the first 60 days, we try to provide some financial assistance to at least start the offender in some kind of compliant housing. And so those expenses are obviously extremely high, as you have to search high and low for any housing that can be within the law.
It all sounds completely counterintuitive and counterproductive. But with this 83% in San Francisco, you're not going to be able to house those people, are you? Or you're trying, but you can't seem to get lower than 83% at this point.
Yeah, so there's 85 active sex offenders in San Francisco, and 71 are transient sex offenders, and very difficult to place.
Now, they have to come back to San Francisco because they committed their crime in San Francisco? Is that the requirement?
County of last legal residence, yes. Last
legal residence. And then what do you do if you know you're sending someone into homelessness? I mean, you know that their county, for San Francisco, for example, is not going to be able to house them.
So Robert can talk, Mr. Amberselli can talk a little bit about this. We try to work with local law enforcement and with local officials to try to ease that transition, but it's very difficult.
How can you legally keep people from living somewhere? I mean, I know the law says it, but I mean, legally they have constitutional rights to live somewhere.
Conditions of parole?
That's correct, conditions of parole. So upon release, I think the Secretary was just talking about that, the primary responsibility of the agent is to get that information prior to them coming out. The institutions provide that information to us. We go through the file, look and tailor conditions of parole based on what their needs are. And obviously with sex offenders, one of the biggest concerns and costs to the division or to the state is the housing of those offenders. While you're on parole, just like you can place somebody on GPS under certain penal code sections, because we have the authority for those folks, we can also require that they stay within that county of last legal residence. Now, there are certain things that allow us to go outside of those boundaries. For instance, victims may request that the department places those folks outside. We do administrative placements and those kinds of things. But traditionally, we stay within 5% export-import. We do not export people without a 5% ratio in import to export out of those counties.
Well, go ahead.
Senator, can I also add another dimension to this? Because I think CDCR has an enormous challenge trying to identify housing for these folks. Because in addition to, I mean, it happens in San Francisco by the nature of the geography there is in many ways sort of the poster city county for challenging placements. But on top of that, local jurisdictions have also been given the affirmative authority to add additional residency restrictions that they do at the local level. So on top of, you know, what CDCR faces in terms of trying to make placements in any city or county in this state, they also are now, you know, there are 30 or 40 different jurisdictions who have enacted additional restrictions.
And that was an allowance of Prop 83
It was absolutely. And actually, California is unique in the nation for creating that affirmative allowance. Every other state has said the state law is going to be the absolute most of what you can do, because they were concerned about, I think, precisely the arms race that's going on in California right now, that if one were to say, we are horrified by the idea that folks going into San Francisco are homeless, therefore they should go to another county, then another county obviously would then immediately run up, you know, probably an adjacent county, would immediately run up and say, well, then we're going to, you know, also preclude them from water parks, national parks, libraries, and I think one county here in California actually precludes a sex offender from living near another sex offender, which, how to enforce that, I don't know, and how to sort of try to identify how to do that. But that's the moving target that I think CDCR is being faced with in terms of trying to be an enforcing agency, and one that has created an enormous amount of confusion from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, that sometimes the public is aware of the general state law, but then on top of that, you know, what has the city done, what has the county done, what about unincorporated areas, you know, all of these sort of additional things have added complexity and really made the task for corrections even more difficult.
And my last question, then I'll turn to my colleagues, is to the Secretary, how do you begin to move toward the containment model that's being suggested by the board, given your acknowledgement that there's very little treatment, there's no funding for treatment, you've got this great requirement and expense for GPS, that supervision is also limited due to resources, polygraph all of that? How do you begin to move in that direction?
You just do it. So we'll start with 800, and we'll issue the IFB in the next 30 days. And I told my staff I want those offenders supervised by the end of this fiscal year. It'll cost $8 million, $8 million, frankly, that we don't have. But the legislature did provide funding for sex offender treatment, and to wipe it all out, I think would be contrary to legislative intent with regard to those funds also. So working with Department of Finance and the administration, we've decided we're going to, it'll be scaled down, but we're going to start. And so the first 800 will come online in June, barring more appeals and investigations and whatever else occurs in this kind of process. But it's our hope that we just start, and then you measure. And if you can come back and show that the recidivism rates are down for those offenders who are involved in the containment model, which all the evidence says that it will, then we can come and bang the table and say, you know, give us more money for containment and we'll save you dollars in terms of enforcement. And really that's a place that we'd like to be, you know, in a year from now, is to be able to expand the containment model because we're able to show it works. Until we start, we won't have that evidence.
I don't want to put, one moment please, I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth, but is it accurate to say, I guess I'll speak to the whole table here, that corrections could much better succeed in embracing and enacting the containment model if there were amendments made to Prop 83 so that dollars could be saved from ineffective programs and put into more effective programs, as outlined in the containment model?
There was a big pause. I think that's one way you could start doing it, absolutely. I think because Prop 83 is one of the bigger, most significant pieces of legislation, it would be a natural place to start to do the cost-benefit analysis that you were talking about. What's working? What do we want to keep? And then what can we scale back and redirect? And that's a balance that the board's trying to maintain this whole time. But that might be a logical place to start. There may be other places to look as well, but that could provide a framework for us trying to assess how could we spend the money in the way that is going to result in the most effective means of preserving public safety.
Secretary, do you have a comment there?
I would just say it's the example set by the governor and the legislature in passing SB 183X, I think, is sound. It's a good example where we went from a system where 100% of offenders were all being supervised and at 70-1, with the exception of some specialized caseloads, and we decided by taking the lowest risk 15% off of active supervision, we could lower those caseloads down to 45 or 48-1. And just do a much better job supervising the higher risk offenders, making us, you save $100 million through SB 183X on parole. And I think if you talk to our agents who work the streets, they'll tell you that at 48-1, they got a shot at doing their job. And at 70-1, they really didn't. They're a great, hardworking group of people who were in a situation where it was really difficult to succeed. So, I think that's an example of something that where you can make that work.
But you've also told us that the requirements of Prop 83 are causing you to spend tens of millions of dollars, potentially with little benefit, on GPS for everybody. You've also told us that you have extraordinarily high housing costs as a result of the residency restrictions. So, would you like any of that revisited just to free up some of these dollars?
I think, ultimately the department is committed to evidence-based policing and evidence-based corrections. And so, we certainly, as anybody, with any department, we've spent money on things in the past that didn't work, from Scared Straight to who knows what other program that sounded good at the time, but it turned out didn't prevent crimes. Our view is on all these things, we try to focus on what's the evidence say works and how do we do more of that and less of things that don't work.
Senator Negrete-McLeod.
I asked the other panel the thing. I'll just ask you the same thing, and this is not rhetorical. How can we help us so that I don't pass a law that says you do this, and then Mr. Leno passes a law that contradicts what I just said, that you can't possibly comply with, and then Mr. Desaulnier passes another law that says that all three of us are just making you go cuckoo.
What makes you think I'd be the author of that?
No, okay. No, how can we, because, we're this legislature, and we will do this. And then the next legislature comes in, and then they will countermand what we did because they think their way is better. And then the next one comes in, and then they think their way is better. And they've got you all in a knot going every which way, and you just couldn't possibly comply with everything that we thought was just absolutely wonderful.
Well, I think really I'd echo what Ms. Brown-McBride said, which is that we have to try to gently remind the legislature and other policymakers about what the evidence says, and try to do that before we get ourselves in the position that you've described. And so I think the one really positive thing I can report is that as far as I know as of today, we at the administration are going to continue to fund the Sex Offender Management Board. And so that's a terrific step in that direction. It's a small step, but it's an important one to keep information coming about. It really holds us all accountable to trying to do what works.
But you see, you are all the experts, and when they tell you something because they're experts in what they do, and they tell you that this works and this doesn't, how do you relay that to us? Because, we often think we're smarter than everybody else. So, I mean, how do you let us know that you, in fact, do believe what they say is reality and not what our reality is?
Well, I think it's like any other sensitive policy area where it's both in the public setting like this, and it's also one-on-one in your office, where you can grill us at your leisure on what's best policy and why are we doing it this way versus that way. And it's trying to make sure that our staff are responsive to you and your questions, and that you get the responses you need. I think it's all the little nuts and bolts kind of government 101 stuff that gets missed sometimes in the heat of the moment during a particularly emotional set of facts.
Senator Desaulnier.
That was a good segue. So I'm going to try to be evidence-based and not action, but I guess, I hope I'm not rationalizing here. As a representative who represented the area where the crime was largely taken place, and my interaction with you. And let me say that, my own feeling, Secretary Kate, of your good intentions and your hard work, both as an IG but as a secretary, too, to make things better and make Californians safer. And I'm very confident that trust is not misplaced. And most of your organization as well. I think the members I have met of the CDRC believes that they are doing a valuable service protecting Californians. Having said that, in the Garrido case, I've been told that up to 25 times the GPS system wouldn't work, whether he walked down a hallway. So even if the risk assessment would be different, you still had, as you have explained, a technology, in terms of not overpromising and under-delivering, a technology that even if the risk assessment are right, it seems like it wouldn't have been terribly helpful to you, where your parole officer was being given information, granted it was different risk assessment, which wasn't accurate. 25 times a day, if that's close to being accurate, just because he was walking down a hallway. And then it's sort of the little boy who cried wolf syndrome is you stop listening. So how would the risk assessment made anything different with the GPS?
Well, you've, in one question, identified about 5 different problems that need to be addressed. Really, one is the concerns that we assess people correctly. It's one thing to have focus on 20 high-risk sex offenders. It's another to have a high-risk sex offender on a low-risk sex offender caseload. I think that issue has been tackled. The issue with GPS is thorny. It is difficult because that technology is not perfect, and it will continue to send out alarms that really should be filtered through, because we really don't care if he's gone from one room to another and the hallway restricts that signal. And so it really comes down to, I think, and I think Mr. Amberselli would echo in this, that it's about not relying so heavily on that technology and relying instead on one hand, good cop work, making sure that you know the neighbors. We didn't do a good enough job with that, making sure that you've shook the fences, and even though you think you understand the outline of this backyard, to take a look around a little further and to try to ask more questions. That's just good cop work that comes with better training. And again, I think field training officers and line-level supervisors help. But part of this is to be more realistic on our expectations regarding GPS. And to the extent that the department is going to get criticized because we didn't follow up on 25 signals every day of something wrong with this GPS with every offender, that's just a no-win game that doesn't really get us anywhere. So again, I think that as we reduce the number of offenders on each caseload and as we improve the technology, we'll get better. The truth is, though, that technology and the work the agents do, we're still in that process of improving that system. The more important piece is to really, I think, embrace the containment model, which would have told us, either through a polygraph or through another meeting with a neighbor or in a treatment setting, that this offender was acting in a way that was suspicious. So I guess what often gets portrayed in the media is that the GPS is the be-all and end-all, and in truth, it's just one tool in the arsenal of a good agent who has the resources he or she needs to do their job.
Well, I guess, Mr. Secretary, from a fiscal standpoint, I want to give you the resources, and our committee wants to give you the resources that makes the public as safe as it can be. So the political optics, maybe we have to challenge. So if the GPS, if it's not giving you as much bang for buck, maybe we need to put more money on feet on the ground, as you have suggested. But that leads to the next question, and I'm sorry to have to ask this, but I think it's a question that the public wants to know. The caseload will be less, but and I know that the parole agents suffer from this too. I'm not going to try to blame them. But a professional goes into that house, sees a minor in there. It's a condition of the parole, the minor shouldn't be there, and that boots on the ground takes the sex offender, the convicted sex offender's word that minor is his niece. And then, how do you, is in your mind's eye the fact that we're going to a lower caseload and a little more training preclude that from happening again? It doesn't it seem sort of very frustrating in the least that happened?
It is frustrating. And the most frustrating part is that there are real victims here.
Yes.
And that we had a couple of chances to figure this out before we did, and we missed those. And that's terribly frustrating. The truth is that, ultimately in working with local law enforcement, he was apprehended, and through the teamwork of local law enforcement and parole. So I'm glad about that. But I'm not going to sit here and say that through these changes and these resources that our agents are going to be 100% perfect. Mm-hmm. He was an adult sex offender, and so the agent saw what he thought was a 13-year-old female, got an explanation from a particularly smooth operator, and made a judgment mistake and didn't investigate that further. I know that agent would, give anything to have that day over again. But at a 40-to-1 caseload, and as you've said, up to hundreds of things that they've got to do every day, I can't promise that we're going to be perfect. All I can tell you is that we at least need to take those steps that have already been identified on training and supervision and caseloads and active GPS for high-risk sex offenders and a containment model, and do all those things. So, frankly, you got to live with yourself when these mistakes happen, and that's not easy to do in my job or in that agent's job. But you sleep a lot better if you know that you've done everything you could. Even though mistakes like that will still happen, undoubtedly. And
I think that's true for us as well. I don't want to run out and run a bill or that will cause you to probability to increase as opposed to decrease. And then just lastly, be perfectly honest about the department's response afterwards, because we tried to have communication that, to my view, was somewhat successful just between you and I, knowing that both of us are busy and some of the meetings that we missed were my fault. But the difference between what the Contra Costa sheriff did in terms of the response when his deputy went to the door and failed to go in, and the difference, at least the optics of what the department did, were two different things that seemed to me to be not inaccurate. That we, and maybe it was because of litigation, you're the former IG, but you thought the Inspector General's report would be, at least my impression, would substantiate that the department did everything it could. And in terms of transparency, I just think, in some instances it's better, and I think you agree with this, that we're just honest with people, that people do make mistakes and technology make mistakes. And maybe this was just an anomaly. You had a really smooth operator in a situation that we shouldn't be driven by. But I think our response, maybe in hindsight, could have been a little different. You have any?
Well, I think the Contra Costa sheriff showed great leadership in what he did in his decision. And I think we could have done a better job initially in describing what we knew about the situation. The difficulty, of course, comes in trying, unlike the sheriff's situation where he had one instance that he could identify and discuss, we had a 10-year parole record to try to understand, to try to comprehend, and then to discuss. We also, at the time, believed we were under pretty severe restrictions regarding privacy. Now, the courts have said we have much more freedom than we thought we had, and so that helps a little bit as well. But I think, if I had it to do over again, we would have tried to been more on the front side of that as opposed to the back side. We knew that the Inspector General has complete access to every one of our records, and I had every confidence would do a full and thorough job, and I don't think there's anybody who could argue that he left any stone unturned in that very public report. Nonetheless, if for no other reason than for public confidence, if we can get out in front of these issues in the future, I think that's good counsel.
Well, I think in terms of the original comment about evidence for action, it's easier for us to be open and upfront, knowing we live in the environment we do, and having faith that the general public understands that we are humans and mistakes will be made no matter how tragic. But I thank you for your testimony.
Thank you, Senator. I think we are near the hour of concluding. Just a couple of last-minute thoughts. Cameras are here, we know, because of the heightened nature of this horrific Garrido case and the extraordinary aspects of it. But it's almost counterintuitive to the message you wanted to deliver to us, which was that these kinds of cases are the exception, not the rule, and that if families really do want to keep their children safe from predators and communities want to keep themselves safe, they have to understand that 90% of the time that the child victim knows the offender. And I wish my colleagues in this building would understand that as well. But that's a harder conversation to have. That's something we don't really want to talk about, that we know the offenders, that they have and that they have access to their victims because of the nature of the familial relationship. So I would hope that somehow that is reported as opposed to the mistakes that were made in parole supervision, or that the risk assessment was mistaken. Those are horribly unfortunate facts, and real human beings suffered as a result. But if we want to talk about 90% of the cases, that's not the problem. So I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Again, thanks to our board for your tireless volunteer service and the expertise you bring to it, from law enforcement and from the science-based evidence to the victims' advocacy, all of the components that make this board's work so very important. And then I think we all want to especially thank the chair of the board, Suzanne Brown McBride, not only for the great job you have done, but because you're going to be leaving us. I understand you've got a new position in New York you're going to be starting very soon. So we wish you great success and hope you know how sincere our appreciation is of not only the great work you do at CalCasa, but also for having the courage to speak the truth when people have not wanted to hear it. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you all. and I thank my colleagues and staff for helping put the hearing together. We stand adjourned.